This episode includes me trying to make sense of John and the Buddha, and it features four aliens trying to make sense of a truck on a desert highway. How do these two things go together, and what does that tell us about reality, if anything? I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. John meets Buddha. I've been looking forward to getting these two into the same room after spending one-on-one time with them over 20 episodes, about 10 episodes each. And now here we are, two of my good friends, all three of us together in the same room. Now what? Well, I have a list of things I want to talk about, a list that's been developing over the course of the last 20 episodes or so. And if you're new to the podcast, that means you've missed a lot. And as you join us in my living room for coffee, you might start feeling a little lost, like the feeling of sitting around with a group of people who've known each other for a long time and sharing lots of inside jokes and shared stories. As I begin, I want to apologize in advance. Even though I am going to boil down my list to three main themes, there are going to be a lot of things that we've covered in prior weeks that I have to just assume everybody knows. The only way to make up for that would be either for me to go over all of it again in one episode, took me 20 to do it, or to encourage you to go back and start there. So again, I apologize. My three big questions for these two friends: what's real? What's wrong? And how do we fix it? So I'm going to begin by asking my friends to talk about what's real. What is the word I would use? Ultimate reality, although I'm very aware that is vocabulary neither friend would actually use. However, since I already know that they're going to differ, both in their worldview and how they see things, and in how they describe that worldview, in other words, the language and the vocabulary they use, it might help for me to say a little bit about my approach as I anticipate the conversation. So let me tell a story. Four aliens visited the Earth, and since their mode of seeing did not work on our planet, their primary way of experiencing Earth when they arrived was by touch. Near to where they first arrived was a long, solid, flat surface, what you and I would immediately recognize as a highway. To one side of the highway, there was a physical object, and you and I would recognize that right away as a pickup truck. It was on the side of the road because it had run out of gas. Unable to see, the four aliens just bump into it, and each one began to touch it, approaching the object from different angles. One alien approached from the front and touched the front hood, which had cooled after rolling to a stop. The alien moved whatever they used to touch with, let's call it a hand, and they moved that over the surface back and forth. The second alien arrived from a side of the truck where the truck door was closed. The being touched the door and felt it carefully, up and down. The third creature approached the truck from the opposite side, where a door actually had been left open. And this alien was able to reach inside and discover that the driver's seat and its cushions felt a certain way, and they were able to press down, as if sort of testing the padding. The fourth came to the truck from the rear, and after touching the tailgate, they moved to each side of the tailgate. The creature touched the back of the gate, the sides of the truck bed, reached inside, moved its hand, quote-unquote hand, around the bottom of the truck bed, which had ridges in it and what we would know is a hard plastic coating. After several moments of this touching, the aliens began to communicate with each other about what they learned, what they experienced about this object. The first alien said, "Well, the object is very smooth and hard. It's flat and horizontal and cool." The second alien said, "I agree the object is smooth, hard, and cold or cool, but it is not horizontal, it's vertical. The third one said, "You're both wrong. I found a hard surface, but it has a box inside. It's an empty space, and inside that emptiness is something soft. I pressed on it. It gave way to the pressure of my touch. It was like an enclosure that I could get inside." The fourth one said, "I'm not sure what you three are touching. I agree there's hard surfaces. I found 4 vertical ones, but they had no top. There was nothing to get inside. They formed something like a small wall around an empty inner space, and that had a flat horizontal bottom to it, which was also hard, but it wasn't smooth. It had ridges." Well, they argued and debated for a while, and then, unable to come to a conclusion, they departed to report to their superiors and allow us to proceed with our conversation. So back to John and the Buddha. Well, it's likely pretty obvious how my story of the aliens fits, and not just for meeting up with John and the Buddha, because those are just 2 of the friends my podcast is going to include. So things are only going to get messier moving forward when we get to Moses and the Gita and Lao Tzu and Muhammad, and they all get into the mix. Obviously, my friends are like the aliens that touched the truck. And again, I'm sure it's fairly obvious how the truck story explains my approach, at least generally, to questions about worldviews and especially religious worldviews, the ways that sacred heritages see things. But I want to add a few details just to be totally transparent about how I actually view this story informing or expressing my approach. First, there really is a truck. In other words, there is something true with a capital T in the way I see things. And in this case, it's the truck in the story, and the aliens are each touching that real thing, and they all have something to report based on their experiences, something real. John and the Buddha, later all the others, are actually all touching the truck. 2, they knew the truck, quote unquote, by experiencing it. In the story, the aliens were limited to the sense of touch. In reality, human beings have many senses. We have reason. I think that's a sense, and I learned that from the Buddha. Imagination, memory, emotion, many, many more. Physical senses, as well as these interior, we might say, cognitive senses. And even our use of reason, which is so highly valued in Western philosophy and religion, is really just one way that we experience reality. The point is, unlike the aliens in my story, in real life, my friends aren't limited to just one way of knowing the truck. They each have many ways of knowing available to them, and they use different ways of knowing, but they are all knowing the truck. Third, each alien is describing the part of the truck that they touch. None of them have the whole picture or cover every aspect of reality. To agree with one is not to imply that the others are all wrong. And let's not miss the point that in order to describe the part of the truck they're touching, while the aliens presumably all spoke the same language, my friends have communicated in Greek and Pali and Hebrew and Sanskrit and Chinese and Arabic. In addition to their linguistic differences, they each employed different concepts to communicate their experiences of the portions of the truck they encountered. And some of those concepts are difficult to render in another language, which means, point 4, each one needs to be heard on its own terms. There's no way to get to know the truck better if each alien remains silent and doesn't add to the data. The experience that each one has of the truck needs to be described as it is, in their own words, the words of the alien touching that portion. During the first 18 verses of John, and with the suttas of the Buddha that I've explored, I've been trying to listen to John and the Buddha tell me about the part of the truck they've been touching. Eventually, that's what I want to do with all my friends. I want to give them each a chance to speak on their own terms. But then, point 5, each one needs to hear each of the others. We're never going to have a more complete picture of the truck if we don't listen to the others who are touching parts of it that we haven't experienced. And we need to listen to what the others describe on their own terms. We need to hear it for what it is and not just reject it because it seems different, nor assume that the others actually just mean the same thing as what we have experienced. Now, this is an approach that I've referred to as mutualism. And of course, my friends aren't aliens, they're human beings, and they're touching something more mysterious than a truck. So I'm trying to use the story of the truck to explain something a lot more complicated than what the aliens experienced. I'm using that story to illustrate an approach to religion and sacred texts that, as I said, I refer to as mutualism. And I use that word because it centers around seeing truth, especially religious truth or spiritual truth, as something that different traditions and experiences contribute to, rather than possess all on their own. In other writing and speaking, I've described mutualism in various versions of this description. It's the way in which we all learn from the insights of others. We all offer our insights to others to learn from, and we all need correction and conversion. So we all receive that as well. It's a mutual process. Now, on the one hand, millions of people have been nourished by each of these sacred friends as the only source of wisdom, spiritual wisdom at least, that they know, without engaging with any other streams. There's millions of Muslims, for example, who only drink from the water of the Quran. And likewise with Christians and the Bible and various Hindu traditions and the Bhagavad Gita or the Vedas, people who've been nourished on Lao Tzu, etc. What I'm inviting us to do is in no way intended to minimize the value of that. But I am motivated by the fact that walking around the truck, so to speak, has enriched my life. There's a personal motivation here that I want to speak to. I'm motivated by the conviction as well, however, not just the personal motivation of my own enrichment, but I'm also motivated by the conviction I have that the world would be a better place if we could find an alternate way for us to engage as spiritual beings, as religious beings, as humans. Much of human history has been littered with the fallout from a viewpoint of religious engagement that we might, I'm using the word engagement with air quotes here, that we might call exclusivism. And it's the view that this religion is right, and, it's mine, of course. All the others are wrong. Or we could insert the words, this religion is superior and better, or all the others are inferior and not good, or not as good. And this approach doesn't necessarily lead to violence and hatred, but in reality, it too often has. It leads to at the least, to a sort of balkanization of humanity, meaning a sort of separation and a compartmentalization of the spiritual wisdom that could be available to us with a different approach. Mutualism is very different than exclusivism. It's also different than what is sometimes suggested as an alternative to exclusivism, tolerance. And don't get me wrong, tolerance is not a bad thing. But tolerance can be practiced without any genuine interest in or significant engagement with another person, or in this case, with another sacred heritage. We can probably all think of examples of disengaged tolerance, like, yeah, I learned to tolerate their annoying habits. We're just different. Well, that doesn't actually speak to a very deep connection between those two people. Now, some might suggest at this point that there's another approach, something other than exclusivism or tolerance. And that other approach might be called dialogue. Religious dialogue is a big deal, actually, in the world of interreligious conversation. And dialogue is, in my view, certainly an improvement of both of those other two, but interreligious dialogue can be and has been practiced as kind of just an intellectual exercise, a way to learn about another tradition, but not necessarily learn from it in such a way as to actually allow myself to be changed. Because typically the rules of an interreligious dialogue, spoken or unspoken, involve the rule that we're not trying to convert each other. And that can very subtly mean I'm not willing to be converted, not willing to change. And I don't mean conversion here as changing my religion and joining another. I mean an inner transformation that happens to me as I actually engage and lean into a different sacred heritage in this case. Mutualism goes further than all those three examples: exclusivism, tolerance, and dialogue. It's an active pursuit to learn, to take in, to be changed, to give, to offer, and yes, to teach, or at least to offer to teach. I have a motive in promoting mutualism as a posture, and there's a personal motive to it. I do think it's a better way, but my interest isn't just theoretical, either for me personally or for making a better world. Let me say more about that motivation, or these two motivations. In my experience, leaning in to listen to others who differ has enriched my own life as a human being. And that includes leaning in to listen to Moses and the Gita and Lao Tzu and Muhammad and Jesus and the Buddha. Not to only explain them or to smooth over their differences, though we might discover things that we thought were irreconcilable that actually aren't, but I actually desire to pay attention to what seems discordant to me, seems out of harmony, because I think sometimes that's where the gold is found. Even so, I end up with all sorts of questions. But these friends have each enriched my life personally. I'm going to share here a poem from my book, The Cow Behind the Barn, which I wrote to try to capture some of this in a more poetic form. It's called Truth and Truths. When my truths hummed in this key and your truths hummed in that, meet and meeting shed each discordant note, align to one true chord, find flight and give voice to living words, then every song will echo, thronging, vibrant, alive, shimmering in a vast chorus of our varied truths woven in one united opus. And all, and each together, with full-throated glee, we will know and name the truth. Now, leaning in to listen to my friends, Moses and the Gita and Lao Tzu and Muhammad and Jesus and the Buddha, has introduced me to glimpses and shimmers of how their various songs are echoing together, thronging, vibrant, alive, shimmering in a vast chorus, and sometimes I can taste something like that full-throated glee. So again, I'm motivated personally, but as I've already said, there's more motivation for me than just that. I honestly think that moving beyond exclusivism and mere tolerance and dialogue can result in something good for humanity, something less violent, something less divisive, and more than that, something that enables us to have a more complete picture of reality, like the aliens and the truck. And as a result, this whole project is a sort of long, extended invitation to mutualism for us personally, and I hope in some small way to contribute to humanity being more fully what humanity is. All right, so where do I go with these two guys, John and the Buddha? I feel like they've, ever since the start of this podcast episode, the one we're in now, as I said, I'm going to talk to these guys. It's kind of like they've been waiting on my front porch, ringing the doorbell over and over and over, waiting for me to come to the door and let them in. So, okay, here we go. Back to my three big questions. The three things I really want to talk to these two about, of course, after all the polite pleasantries and coffee and getting sat down. What is real? What's wrong? How do we fix it? And now, what the heck? I'm just going to use their Englishized names, taking the Pali version of the Buddha's birth name, and just jump in with both feet. So, John, Siddhartha, what is real? And I can imagine there's just sort of a silence hanging in the room. And then maybe the Buddha decides to speak first. I don't know, though he's comfortable with silence, so maybe he doesn't speak. And then John might be thinking, well, Buddha came on the scene about 600 years before me, so maybe he should, go first, and I'll wait for him. Anyway, let's say that ultimately, after who knows how long of silence, the Buddha's the first one to clear his throat and give a reply. Well, Kevin, that that really is jumping into the deep end, isn't it? Can I suggest that we start with a prior question, if that's all right? Well, of course, I would say. The Buddha continues. Thank you. So I would suggest that John and I, is it all right to call you John? Right. Okay. Well, I suggest John and I begin by talking about how we each began, kind of the story behind the story, if that's okay. Well, certainly, I would interject. And so they did. And let's imagine that as they did, I took notes, and that what follows here is my summary of the conversation about how they got started and how they each started, not only got started in the conversation, but how they each started to sort out what was real. Where my friends began. Here's my notes, and I'll start with Buddha first. Most people who know something about the Buddha's life are going to likely be familiar with the fact that he was raised in comfort, wealth, and what we would call privilege. His father wanted to shelter and protect him from the real world. His journey towards enlightenment began when he experienced 4 sights. He saw an old man and a sick person and a corpse and a contented monk. That means an ascetic who had left the normal rhythms of daily life and seemed to have found contentment. He was repulsed by the old man and the sick person and the corpse. And then try to imagine these 3. The sagging skin, thinning hair, limping gait, feeble mind, weak limbs of the old man, the smells and pain and discomfort of the sick person, the rotting flesh and decomposition of the corpse. And the Buddha realized in each case, that's me. That's going to happen to me. I might be young and healthy now, but that is going to change. In fact, everything changes. Nothing stays the same. Nothing is permanent, not even me. And that was painful. It was an insight into the nature of human experience of life as a constant cycle of suffering, meaning one change after another, one loss after another, rooted in a whole nest of mistaken illusions about what is real. The suffering he became increasingly aware of could end, however, and seeing the contented monk had made him think that this could be possible, and his search resulted, in fact, in discovering that this was the case. Suffering can cease. But the end of suffering was going to require facing that craving for permanence and the illusion of permanence, unmasking the illusions that lead to the craving for permanence and the things we like, and craving for them not to pass away. And the main illusion that needs to be unmasked, as it turns out, is the illusion about who or what we are. This self that I think is me is not what I thought. I interject. So I can see how the way your journey started got you to our 3 main themes. What's wrong, how to fix it, and what's real, although I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, Buddha. I can imagine the Buddha gave a thumbs up. Although, okay, I'm speaking metaphorically here. I'm not sure if the Buddha, if he were here in my actual house in the year 2026, would be the sort of person who gave a thumbs up or not. It seems a little undignified and casual to me, but it summarizes the gist of his response. All right. What did John say? And this is a little tricky because there's some disagreement among scholars about which John might be the one who wrote the book I have used in the podcast. So who is it that's sitting in my room? I've got my own opinions about what scholars have said about the authorship of the book known as the Gospel of John and the letters that also bear that name. And all that's grounded in my research. And without getting into all that, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to use the name John, quote unquote, to refer to whoever it was who composed the 18 verses I explored in the early episodes, and to the person who composed a letter that came to have the title 1 John. I'm actually convinced that those two are the same person. In other words, that the same hand wrote the first 18 verses of the gospel and the first letter. But that gets into all sorts of questions that really aren't important here. In fact, they might, in a sense, belong to my version of Buddha's list of unanswered questions. All right, at any rate, the opening words of the letter known as 1 John are what I'm going to use as a sort of backdrop for my summary of this part of the conversation between the Buddha and John about how they came to hold the views that they do about what's real. This is my way, it's the backdrop to my presentation of trying to summarize John's part in that conversation. And it's going to include some of my own narrative, but it's based on my interpretation of what he wrote in Greek in the opening of that letter. And I'm going to put it into third person to read like I'm giving a report of his words, which is what I'm pretending to do here. John's views about what is real, what's always been real from the beginning, came as a result of his relationship with and deep friendship with Jesus. He said that his whole message came from what he heard and saw in companionship with that man. He speaks of the ways that he was hearing and seeing, but he also says that he touched, and he touched what he talks about. He touched it with his hands. In other words, he touched Jesus. What was it that he heard and saw and touched? He calls it life in the letter, a kind of life that is outside time. Eternal life is the word used in both the Gospel of John and the letter. There, no beginning, no end, not temporal. In the first 18 verses of the Gospel of John, he added that the source of that life that is outside time is the divine, God, whom John described like this, and I'm going to use my translation of verses 1 and 2 and verse 18 of the Gospel of John, chapter 1. And for all the background to that, I'm going to refer you back again, with apologies, to the earlier episodes. But here's my translation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word, namely, God was the Word that was towards God in the beginning. No one has ever seen that God, but the one and only God, who leans into the Father's bosom, that one has brought God out into the open and made God known. John got this way of seeing reality by experience. Seeing, touching, hearing, living with, and eating with Jesus. This gave him a first-hand way of experiencing Jesus' experience of the divine as love, and of himself as beloved, meaning Jesus' experience of himself as beloved, and then later John's experience of himself as beloved. John's experiences led him to conclude that all of us can experience what I will call being in union with that divine life. Or, in words that John reported from Jesus in the Gospel of John, you're in me and I'm in you. John became convinced that we too can be included in the union that's described there, that we too could say that. So, back to the truck and the question of what is real. Both John and Buddha are actually grounded in observation and direct knowing. This was really interesting to me to observe. The Buddha went forth, saw the four sights, and embarked on a quest involving observation, questions, paying attention, more questions, and so on. And that quest eventually resulted in an awakening, an experience of freedom and release. And at the very core of that awakening was an insight into the nature of reality, including what we call the self, as on the one hand, impermanent and in a very real sense unreal, and on the other hand, the awakening included the experience of what can be called bare awareness, awareness itself, and especially in the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, this is in some way associated with or can result in the experience of an all-encompassing compassion, compassion in us, for all things, something we share in and extend, which is beginning to sound like the language of union that John uses. Speaking of John, John also went forth, we could say. And he also says that what he knows and what he tells us came about as a result of direct knowing and experience and reflection on that. In John's case, what he observed and touched was a man, Jesus. What he experienced was not only Jesus' words and actions, but also, and especially, I think, Jesus' experience of the divine. And what he experienced, he came to describe as life. And that life that he speaks of is a life that is outside of time, outside of all the temporal, impermanent reality that Buddha also noticed. A life that John said results in light, or as he put it, in the divine being was life, and that light was light for all people. He's speaking here of something other than the impermanent, and also something other than what we know or understand. That's what's represented by light. The life that gives us light, light as knowledge and wisdom here, existed prior to that light, that wisdom. It's grounded ultimately in the divine itself. John has several ways of speaking about what life is and what the divine is like, but in his letter, his shorthand version is God is love. Now, my two friends use very different vocabulary and have different concerns and different interests, but as these two circled the truck together, I think both of them would agree that reality is not the impermanent, temporal, passing, changing world we think we know. There is something other, something different, something that is, quote unquote, not. That is not this and not that, not anything, not any idea that is in that chain of cessation and origination, as the Buddha would say, including not the self we think we know and not the self that is knowing these things, not our self, nor any other self. Without trying to represent all the other episodes devoted to the Buddha and to John, let me offer this summary of what that other, quote unquote, is, the other that truly is, even though, again, Buddha's not going to use that language, but it truly is precisely because it is not. By which I mean it's not the other that we can imagine and describe. In other words, it's not the other that is part of the impermanent, ceasing, arising, ceasing chain that the Buddha talks about. It's part of eternal life, as John would say. So again, I can't repeat everything from the prior episodes. I'm just going to try to give a summary of how they might describe all this to each other, or rather how I'm describing what I think they would say to each other. In order to have some sort of reference point, I'm going to use the term self, quote unquote, for a point of comparison. I could probably use consciousness or mind as well, but self seems the most obvious choice to me. I'm going to describe the Buddha's view as I've come to understand it, and then I'm going to let John respond. What we experience as the self only arises in interconnection with other things. It's interdependent, not independent. And as a result of being interdependent and interconnected, the self changes constantly. The self then possesses no permanent essence of its own. The Buddha used the word empty as one way to describe this, though for most of us, using the word empty creates a misunderstanding. The self is empty in the sense of not being or having a permanent, separate essence in disconnection with all else. But empty doesn't mean a void. And so at the same time, and quite paradoxically, it's possible to speak of the self in relationship to fullness as well. In certain Mahayana traditions, for example, as we've seen in prior episodes, there is what is called Buddha nature or Buddha mind, the pure, radiant, boundless, true nature inherent in the interconnection of all beings. And the nature of that pure, radiant mind, quote unquote, is an all-encompassing compassion. There's no self. What self we do imagine is empty. It's empty of selfness. But the not self can in fact be said to be full. not just a void. It's full of the all-encompassing compassion of the quote-unquote Buddha mind. Now let's give John a chance to respond. John doesn't use the word self, and he doesn't speak of emptiness. In fact, he actually, in those first 18 verses, talks about fullness. But he's aware of permanence and impermanence, and would, I think, feel at home speaking of the self the way the Buddha does, if they could sit down and talk it through. I think John would feel at home speaking of the interconnectedness of all things, though he might add words, and in fact he did add words, all created things came to be in him. In other words, all created things are in an interconnected existence with each other in the divine. In fact, to literally quote him, all things came to be through him, nothing came to be apart from him, and in him was life. And the him there that he's referring to is the God towards whom the Word was, and the God that was the Word that was towards God. That is, the life of all things is in the divine, and thus connected in and by the divine for John. And we'll have to come back to divine and maybe what the Buddha would say about that. But given the interconnection of everything with the divine, I think John would say that there is at least some way in which even the divine being, God, does not exist in a static, unchanging, isolated state of being, beingness. That's more of a Greek philosophical concept. Interconnection implies experiencing the other, which or with whom we are connected. And this inescapably implies change. If God is interconnected, John says God is, and if God is interconnected with you and I, and we experience change, then God experiences change. Now, how does John see the nature of the divine being? I coined a few terms for what John says in John chapter 1 about this, and those terms are in the prior episodes. But what I especially have in mind right here, coming out of those first 18 verses of the Gospel of John, are the terms I coined: into-ness, towardsness, and embrace. And in the letter of John, all that gets condensed into one little phrase: God is love. John also adds the point that no one's ever seen this reality. No one's ever seen God. And that implies, conceptually, that's empty. But that's a whole other topic. So I think John would be comfortable with the Buddha's convictions that our ideas and cognitive formulations, which he says depend on other mental formulations, should not be equated with reality. And that's why I said just a moment ago, that sounds an awful lot like the Buddha's idea of empty, or at least some aspects of the Buddha's idea of emptiness. But John also wrote the mysterious comment in John chapter 1 that the only God who is into the very bosom of God brings God out. That's John chapter 1, verse 18. This is clearly somehow a more proactive, even personal, but more than personal, way of seeing what is really real than what we see, at least in the surface, in the Buddha. The divine nature for John is more than personal, as I said. And in vocabulary that I've used elsewhere, it's a singular plural and a plural singular. And at the end of the day, that's not a self as we know it, is it? Which makes me wonder if the Buddha and John might actually, again, be closer on this point about what a self is than what may seem to be the case at first glance. From my point of view, as I listen to my friends and I hear them talk about God, the Buddha mind, into-ness, towardsness, love, timelessness, outside the chain and cycle of change, interconnection, and all-encompassing compassion, I think all of that is coming from their descriptions of the truck that they touched. The Buddha and John did touch different parts of the truck, and they used different words to describe those experiences, but I would say that they also emphasize different aspects of the same truck. So, How do we put all that together is the thing that I've been ruminating on. So what if they're describing a reality that is ultimately love and an all-encompassing compassion? What if we could summarize it that way? And if that is what is really real, although again, I don't know that either of them would use that word. John would say it's true, but even then, what he means by true is not conceptual truth, but a reliability. And what Buddha's trying to discover is what is really there. How do we directly know things as they are? Anyway, if compassion, all-encompassing compassion and love, are what is true in John's words, what is really there for the Buddha, then why is it that everything else we experience in our day-to-day life and in the headlines and in our history, why is everything else so, well, not like that? It sure seems like compared to that, something's wrong. And that will bring me to the two other questions. What's wrong? And how can it be fixed? But as you've probably guessed, that's for next time.